July 24th, 1915, a Saturday in Chicago, Illinois. A surprisingly mild day in the middle of summer. Just the day before, it had been 10 degrees higher. Thunderstorms swept sporadically across the city, keeping many inside, but down at the Chicago River, between LaSalle and Clark Street, the riverfront was bustling with activity. Hundreds of people are crowded, excitedly stepping aboard an excursion steamer that's going to take them for a day of fun. Directly across the river looms the red brick facade and the beautiful clock tower of the brand new Reed, Murdoch & Co. office building. Those working through the weekend there have a good view directly opposite as the excursion steamer loads its human cargo, but any keen-eyed observers might have noticed it beginning to wallow in the water, leaning this way and that. No matter, small steamers came and went from here every day. With loading about complete, one final passenger jumps between shore and a ship. On the upper deck, a small band plays lively ragtime tunes. Then, as the little white ship begins to cast off from the wharf, it rolls, sluggishly, but quickly enough to catch the musicians off guard. Their music stops as they fall, and the ship lurches heavily. In plain daylight, within full view of the Chicago riverfront and the workers across the way, the ship has capsized. It had barely cleared the wharf. The sinking of SS Eastland has become legend in Chicago, where its sudden, violent loss is an unusually horrific chapter in the city's history. The sinking was bad enough, but the revelations that would come later, the causes of the disaster, would outrage the public and shock even to this day. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and this is the tragic story of the sinking of the SS Eastland. The Great Lakes are like an immense inland sea, providing a vital waterway to link major cities like Chicago, Buffalo, Michigan, Detroit, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and more. For generations, Chicagoans have taken to the lakes on ferries and day trip steamers, but the lakes are no picnic. They can be whipped into frenzied rage by winter storms, or blotted out entirely by dense, impenetrable fog banks. It's thought that between 10 to 20,000 ships or more have been taken by them. In the early morning of July 24, 1915, the sleek, white hull of an excursion steamer rose up from the Chicago River. On the bow of the unusually tall hull, in neat, small letters, was the name Eastland. And of the hundreds of people who crowded aboard that day, not one of them knew that a series of ill-informed decisions and poor design choices had ensured that this morning would probably be their last. The SS Eastland was a passenger ship designed for the lakes. Known as the Great Lakes Speed Queen, she was launched in 1903. For decades, there'd been a bustling passenger trade across the lakes, so countless ferries and steamers were built to capitalise on the demand, operating voyages to link railheads and stop at towns and cities along the way. Aside from operating a regular timetable, ferries could be chartered for events and functions as pleasure cruises and day trips became more popular. The SS Eastland's design and construction was a little unorthodox, and the seeds for the disaster that would occur over 10 years later were sown from the start. The contract for the ship's construction was awarded to the Jenks Shipbuilding Company of Michigan. Now, the shipyard had a history of building freighters and tugboats, and Eastland would be their first and only passenger ship project. Sidney Jenks, the yard's chief designer, consulted with his naval architecture professor from Cornell University on the project, and the pair came up with the outline for their ship. It had a dual purpose, a cargo vessel and a passenger ferry, and it needed to maintain a good turn of speed to keep up the demanding schedule. Capacity for passengers needed to be 500 for overnight voyages, housed comfortably in cabins. But critically, Eastland needed a shallow draft, that is the amount of ship that's below the waterline, to allow it to enter into those shallow ports. The design was finalised, and calculations on the ship's metacentric height and centre of gravity were completed. These all dictate the stability of the ship's final design. But then, the shipyard Jenks, probably at the request of the steamship's future owners, shortened the length by 60 feet and added a passenger deck. Now, this would obviously have a huge impact on the calculations on balance and stability, but apparently no recalculating was done, and no further inclining tests on the ship's stability were carried out. The result was a long, thin, tall ship with a design top speed of 20 knots and some quirky habits. Now, from the beginning, Eastland was known to be top-heavy and had a history of stability issues. She would roll this way and that, and something passengers found funny as the steamer limped into or out of port. It meant for the captain and his engineers, operating the ship was a never-ending game of pumping water into and out of ballast tanks to straighten the ship up. Now, this instability was primarily due to Eastland's relatively narrow beam, or the ship's width, in comparison to its length and height. It made it prone to listing from side to side. The narrow beam was a reflection on Eastland's purpose, speed and efficiency. The beam was one thing, but even more alarming was Eastland's shallow draft. To compensate for a high centre of gravity, designers can give the ship more draft, that's simply more of it under the waterline to ensure stability. Back then, designers of the age set about 60% of the hull below the waterline, but this created more drag and the engines had to work harder. Now, Eastland's draft was already shallow, far less than the usual 60%, but after her inaugural season in 1903, the ship's draft was reduced even further in an effort to gain even more speed. The ship was built for efficiency. As an engineer later put it, the idea was to save coal by keeping the hull as much out of the water as possible. The draft was cut in two. Instead of 60%, only 30% of Eastland's hull could be found below the waterline. Now, the 1903 to 1904 refit reduced the ship's draft and added even more weight above the waterline. Worst of all, Eastland was regularly sailing with well over 2,000 passengers. Measures were taken to try to fix the ship's bad behaviour. The ship's passenger complement was lowered by 200, and some staterooms were taken out. Then, a couple of years later, the remaining cabins were removed because they sat way too high up in the hull, and the funnels were cut down in height. 2 tons of concrete were added lower down to try to balance things out, but still, when loading passengers, the ship was known to dip down in the water by as much as 25 degrees. In August 1913, naval engineer John Devereux York took a voyage on Eastland and was appalled by what he saw. He said, in trying to make the harbour, it was like steering a log of wood. She wouldn't obey the helm. He quickly wrote a letter to the US harbour master of the city's port saying, "You are aware of the condition of the SS Eastland, and unless structural defects are remedied to prevent listing, there may be a serious accident." But he got no response. Now that was already bad enough, but then things got even worse. In response to the Titanic disaster in 1912, new maritime safety regulations were enacted, requiring ships to carry enough lifeboats and rafts for all passengers. For the Eastland, this meant adding additional lifeboats, which would be shipped on the top weather deck. This added tons of weight to the uppermost part of the ship. Now obviously this couldn't go unnoticed, as the already unstable Eastland was renowned for its funny tendency to roll to one side. A. Shantz, general manager of the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company, petitioned hard against this change because, as a ferry operator himself, he knew the danger. Eastland was not a unique case. Many of the Great Lakes ships were designed and built in a similar way. If their upper decks were crowded with lifeboats, they were likely to capsize if the conditions were right. He told Congress, "The extra weight of the lifeboats and rafts would make ships of the Great Lakes top-heavy and unseaworthy, and some of them would turn turtle if you attempted to navigate them with this additional weight on the upper decks." Eastland's owners and operators, the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, complained about the change as well, with the general manager writing to the Secretary of Commerce in Washington and saying, "If it were possible to put this amount of equipment on the Eastland, the weight that would be added to its upper deck would make the boat difficult to handle." Now this all sounds very noble on behalf of Eastland's owners, but now they had a choice to make. With an unmoved government, they could prove that passenger safety was truly at the heart of their complaints by operating Eastland with fewer lifeboats, but a reduced passenger capacity. Now, fewer passengers meant, of course, lower revenue. Or they could accept the danger, fit more lifeboats, and apply for a permit to raise passenger capacity and earn more revenue. Now, Eastland's owners, of course, chose the latter, increased revenue at the expense of their passengers' safety. With Eastland already top-heavy, dangerously unstable, and crammed with massively heavy boats, the St. Joseph and Chicago Steamship Company made a critical modification that upset her even more. The old wood floor had been ripped up and replaced with a layer of thick concrete. That plus another concrete pouring further aft added up to 20 tons of weight above the waterline. The end result was a very cranky ship indeed, and the stage had been set for a disaster of tragic, almost unfathomable proportions. On the morning of July 24th, at 6:30 a.m, Eastland, docked at the Clark Street Bridge, began to take on passengers. The day was planned for a Western Electric Company picnic across Lake Michigan from Chicago to Michigan City, Indiana. Excitement was high, and families arrived early to secure a spot on the ship. Around 7,000 tickets had been sold for the function. Western Electric was just that big of an employer for the city and its surrounds. A total of 5 excursion boats had been chartered for the trip, and hundreds lined up to board Eastland for a day of fun. On the bridge, Captain Harry Peterson supervised loading. He was a short, 55-year-old who'd got his master's license some 14 years earlier and knew Eastland's quirky behaviour quite well. His calm demeanour may have even fooled onlookers into a sense of normality, but all was certainly not well aboard his ship. Passengers tried to shield themselves from the drizzle and poured up the gangways, but then, about 10 to 7, the ship began to show signs of its old instability. As passengers continued to board, the Eastland started to list slightly to starboard, over to the right, indicating the early signs of imbalance. The open gangway doors dropped lower into the river to within just 18 inches or 45 centimetres. Now, this was sufficient to catch the attention of Chief Engineer Joseph Eriksson, but not enough for him to raise the alarm. Incredibly, the chief was just a lad of 23 years old, but he, like Captain Peterson, knew Eastland's quirks all too well. He followed standard procedure, opening 2 portside ballast tanks and flooding them to try to correct the list. Satisfied the issue would resolve itself like it usually did, the engineers got steam on her engines and they thumped suddenly to life. Up above, passengers lined the railings and jammed the small inside spaces of the ship. Bert Cross was a Western Electric employee travelling with 5 co-workers packed shoulder to shoulder on the promenade deck. Nearby, 18-year-old Frank Blaha stood near the rail. He could hear the band playing below his feet, but he was glad to be away from the worst of the crush. Below in the hull, more and more day trippers streamed in at about 50 every minute, and the ship's hull sagged lower and lower into the Brown River. Just 10 minutes later, passenger capacity was reached, and the ship began to list to port up to 15 degrees. Now, this could be attributed to a number of things. For one, around 3/4 of the ship's coal had been incorrectly trimmed and loaded into the port side alone. By flooding the portside ballast tanks, Eriksson was only adding to the improper loading. But even worse, Eastland was probably over passenger capacity. She'd been licensed to carry about 2,570 people, but eyewitnesses suggest there were many more aboard. Chief Engineer Eriksson must have been frustrated the ship was playing up so much. He ordered water discharged from the port ballast tanks, and then the starboard tanks be flooded, but for whatever reason, they refused to work. Passengers were largely unaware of the growing instability, and those that were seemed to laugh it off as a peculiar quirk of the ship. As it rolled this way and that, some oohed and ahed, and all the while the band sawed away at its cellos and bass. So, despite the ship's weird behaviour, the mood of the crowd was light and chirpy. From shore, though, dozens watched puzzled as the ship seemed to lean further and further over onto her port side, while hundreds of people smiled and waved back at them from the decks. But suddenly, unexpectedly, Eastland swung upright onto something nearing an even keel. Maybe the starboard tanks had finally flooded, Eriksson must have thought. This welcome news meant that at 7:20 a.m, Captain Peterson was satisfied loading was complete and Eastland could get underway. With a ring, the ship's bell signalled it was time to go, and her lines began to be cast off. But then, the temporary balance was lost, and Eastland began to sag even faster over to port. Passengers were ordered to move to the starboard side, because alarmingly, water had begun to flood into the open portside gangway doors, which were now within reach of the river. Eastland's captain continued the departure though, and the ship's stern began to swing away from the dock. Now this, and the ship's band, which continued to play, tricked passengers into thinking that all was well, and they began to move away from the starboard side railing to watch the departure. But below their feet, it was impossible for the engineers not to notice the problem that they were suddenly facing as water poured in from above. The engines came to a sudden stop, and Eastland hung suspended just a few feet away from the dock. At around 7:27 a.m, the ship listed to port up to 30 degrees. Water was now roaring through the gangway doors down into the bottom of the ship, causing crew members from down in the machinery spaces to panic and rush up their escape ladders. Crew up top began moving passengers to the starboard side again, but with much greater difficulty because the weather decks were now wet and slippery from the light rain. Just seconds later, Eastland listed sharply to port up to 45 degrees. Now this time the list was so severe that it became clear the ship was in grave danger of fully capsizing. The piano and the large main refrigerator broke free and fell away to the port side, crushing some passengers. And inside the ship, dishes and glasses smashed off of tables. Passengers and crew scrambled to the main staircase to escape, but it caused a lethal bottleneck and hardly anyone could get through. Then, nearing 7:30, the inevitable happened, and Eastland capsized. In a matter of seconds, the ship had rolled completely over onto its port side, trapping hundreds of people inside and throwing many from the upper decks into the Chicago River in a heap. As Eastland rolled, dozens and dozens of people had rushed for the main stairwell, but there was a momentous human crush as they jammed into the tight space and there was no getting through. The stairs collapsed altogether and there was no way out. Then the water began to roar in. It wasn't a gentle, gradual fall, it was sudden and violent. The heavy wood bookcases, the piano, unsecured cargo and heavy equipment, it all rolled and wheeled across the deck and pinned people on the other side with a sickening thud. Passengers were thrown bodily over as their ship came down around them. The jauntily panelled interior, just moments earlier a sight of excitement and happiness, was turned suddenly into a scene from hell as people were flung off their feet into one another, and then white water roared in around them. Passenger George Goyette said, "What I saw was exactly what you see when you watch a lot of children rolling down the side of a hill. The entire crowd of men, women and children came slipping and sliding and sprawling down with a mass of lunchboxes, milk bottles, chairs, rubbish of every sort on top of them. They came down in a floundering, screaming mass, and as the boat turned completely over on its side, crashed into the stairs, carrying them away." For those that lined the riverfront, it was a sudden, shocking moment. The sight was absolutely bizarre because with seemingly no warning, no fire or explosion, no dramatic collision or shouts of panic, the ship seemed to simply tip over before the eyes of hundreds of observers at the dockside or from nearby office buildings. Writer Jack Woodford saw it happen and he wrote, "I watched in disoriented stupefaction a steamer large as an ocean liner slowly turned over on its side as though it were a whale going to take a nap. I didn't believe a huge steamer had done this before my eyes, lashed to a dock, in perfectly calm water, in excellent weather, with no explosion, no fire, nothing. I thought I'd gone crazy." 18-year-old Frank Blaha had been up on the promenade deck when he felt the ship start to go out from under him. He later said they had all those loose folding chairs on the ship and all this glass and the piano that all began sliding when the ship started to tip. The people couldn't hold on to anything, it just went down that fast. And the people on that side, the side toward the center of the river, didn't have a chance. They just rolled right under. He and a friend had rushed down the stairs as the ship went over, and they just managed to make it down the side of the hull, so they stood, helpless and dazed, on the exposed side of the ship. Eastland had rolled so suddenly, and yet dozens had ended up suddenly in the water in thick, sodden wool clothes that dragged them down into the murk. Western Electric man Bert Cross said, "The whole river was a mass of struggling humanity when hundreds were drowning before my eyes. You've probably read about it in the papers, but no one can picture the horror of the scene. Men and women covered with blood from broken windows, children and girls struggling in the water calling for help, and the people trapped within the boat who never had a chance for their life." Because Eastland had sunk at her dock, the response was almost instant, with dozens crowding the ship's hull attempting to haul survivors out. The rescue operation was chaotic and heartrending, with rescuers breaking windows to pull people from the submerged hull. Eastland had rolled in full view, not just of virtually the entire city, but the other chartered steamships, including the Theodore Roosevelt and Petoskey, One lookout from that ship, Peter Boyle, stared on appalled at what he saw. The 26-year-old Irish immigrant had been among a group of officers and men from their ship, which had seen Eastland's listing, and they became uneasy. They'd begun to lower their boats in anticipation of something bad happening, and this keen instinct had been proved right. It meant that almost instantly they got to work and set off to pull people from the water. As one of the boats was going down, Boyle spotted a woman drowning in the water. He dived when the boat was still 15 feet above the river's surface, but he never came back up, either stunned by the impact or held down by a desperate drowning victim. Boyle would be the only victim to die that day who hadn't been aboard the Eastland. Meanwhile, on the Theodore Roosevelt nearby, passengers erupted in panic at the sight of the other ship's loss, and they fought their way off their ship in a frenzied hurry. All around the Eastland's hull, tragic scenes of human suffering were playing out in full view of a stunned crowd ashore. The tug Kenosha, which had been tied up earlier to Eastland's bow in preparation for the departure, made a bridge between the capsized hull and the dock, with the crew hauling people out to safety. A steady, sad stream of people who'd been fortunate enough to make it out and onto the Eastland's overturned hull in time began to march their way off their ship, onto Kenosha, and then onto the wharf. Frank Blaha and his mate just waited until a boat came over to get them. They simply stepped off the overturned hull to safety, but others weren't so fortunate and they had to be bodily hauled out. F.W. Willard was a superintendent of the Western Electric Cable Works, and instead of standing frozen in panic, he rushed to grab a line and started throwing it out to anybody that could catch it. Nearby, another Western Electric man, Howard Wynne, did his best to haul people out of the brackish cold water. "I pulled one old fellow out," he said, on a 2x4 that was at least 2 feet underwater, hanging onto an armchair which refused to sink, so he was floating along about 2 feet under. "I got him to the raft and pumped some air into him and then hoisted him on deck of the Petoskey, and when I got up there he was sitting on the cabin floor with his arms around his daughter, whom he had also pulled out, crying and asking for 2 sisters and the mother who were missing." The rescue effort had been tremendous and instantaneous, with absolutely no warning or coordination. Bystanders, passengers, and crewmen alike had sprung into action to do their best to help, made all the more remarkable because nobody knew if the boilers, which had steam on them, would explode or not. One group of heavy industry workers nearby had rushed aboard a clapped-out tug and somehow got the old engine to work despite having no formal qualifications or seagoing experience themselves. They still managed to pull in about 50 people from the water. Soon, very soon though, it became clear that all that could be done outside had been done, and hundreds were missing, still trapped inside the steel, coffin-like hull. Inside the ship, divers soon got to work, but they soon realised their mission had become one of body recovery. The interior was confusing and extremely disorienting, with everything now rotated 90 degrees. Dozens and dozens of bodies were found jammed in the bottleneck that had formed at the main staircase leading out of the hull. Some had claimed from the outside they could still hear faint tapping and cries from within, so it became clear that the ship would need to be cut open, and acetylene torch-wielding workers began to slice into the steel, but not without complaint from Eastland's own Captain Pedersen, who had survived and watched on appalled at how his ship was being treated. "Here, stop that," he had allegedly cried as the steel was rent open, but one worker brushed him off in disgust. "My orders are to save lives," he had said, "not be careful of the boat." What workers found inside was nightmarish. The result of the sinking had been horrific. 844 passengers and crew killed. In fact, more passengers died on Eastland than had died on Titanic 3 years prior. Nearly 230 victims had been teenagers, 58 were little children. 175 women went home that day as widows, 84 men lost their wives. Whole families were gone. 500 or more Western Electric employees had been wiped out. It had all happened just feet from the dock and safety. Footage from the recovery is so distressing, I can't even show you today, 110 years later. It's just that horrendous. But over the coming days, workers struggled to haul people up from deep within the ship, while pressmen and film cameras snapped away just feet away from them on the riverfront. The brand new red brick Reed, Murdoch & Co. office building and warehouse directly across the river suddenly became a morgue with dozens of unidentified dead lining its ground floor. Now the news was a sensation, and even as bodies were being pulled out of the overturned hull, newspapers ran sordid headlines and indicted owners and shipbuilders alike. Engineer John Devereux York, who had written that letter in 1913 to the Chicago harbour master warning of impending disaster, passed his letter on to the local media, furthering the outrage. Of course, the resulting scandal caused furious, justified questions from the outraged public. How could this have happened when Eastland's design was well known to have been dangerous? Why did the owners operate the ship, and how were they allowed to have operated it at all? Questioning began with Jenks, the designers and builders of the ship. Now it soon became clear that standards of shipbuilding on the lakes had been lax. Sidney Jenks, Eastland's designer, testified that his vessel had only been designed for 500 passengers for the original owners. He said, "I had no way of knowing the quantity of its business after it left our yards." Now damningly, no inclining test on the ship's stability was ever performed. He said that because the ship had been launched on its side, leant over 45 degrees, and then righted itself again, that it had demonstrated its stability just fine, and that was apparently enough. With 6 members of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company indicted for conspiracy and negligence, Judge Clarence Sessions said that there is no proof which tends, even to a slight degree, to fasten such guilt upon any of the respondents. Every act charged and proved against these respondents was done in the usual and ordinary course of business. In fact, the company's knowledge of Eastland's bad past behaviour seems embarrassingly basic. Back in 1913, during discussions around the sale, no mention of the instability was ever made, nor the major listing incidents from early in the ship's career. At an inquest, Walter C. Steele, the company's secretary-treasurer, said, "I didn't know much about the boat except that we had got it at a bargain. All I do is to sign blank checks." So what had happened? Well, in brief, the government had ordered the installation of additional lifeboats if the company had wished to maintain the massive passenger capacity, something Eastland's original builder later testified she'd never been designed for in the first place. In retrospect, we know that Eastland's owners had complained about their ship's seaworthiness with additional lifeboats fitted, but clearly, in opting to fit additional lifeboats to boost passenger capacity, they had chosen profit over safety. In the event, when Eastland rolled over, the lifeboats were basically useless and more of a hazard than anything else. Many of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company executives had avoided extradition to Illinois, staying in Michigan instead to avoid federal charges, and their extradition was barred by the same judge who had said that every act charged and proved against those respondents was done in the, quote, usual and ordinary course of business. If they truly had no knowledge of their ship's strange behaviours and top-heaviness, then surely they need only have looked at the thing as it pathetically limped and listed 10, 15 degrees from side to side, or even read reports from engineers who were tasked with furiously pumping water in and out of tanks to maintain balance. If they were truly concerned for passenger safety, thanks to the additional lifeboats as they had stated earlier, then surely they should have conducted stability and inclination tests on their ship with the lifeboats fitted, but they never did. Now, if not guilty of deliberate manslaughter, then surely Eastland's owners and operators were guilty of extreme incompetence and negligence, but they were never found guilty and escaped unscathed. Unforgivably, they blamed Eastland's chief engineer Erickson for the disaster and maintained that his counter-flooding of the ballast tanks and attempting to mitigate the listing was the cause of the accident. Cases dragged on and on for 2 decades. In 1919, Erickson, the chief engineer, had died, and he became an easy scapegoat for the disaster. In 1933, the matter was closed at a limitation of liability hearings that concluded astoundingly that Erickson's mishandling of the ballast tanks was the cause of the disaster, and the Eastland was, quote, on the morning of July 24, 1915, seaworthy in every respect, fit for the carriage of passengers, if properly handled. The civil trial determined that a payout to the families of victims should equal the value of Eastland's hull, about $50,000 at the time, but first the owners had to pay out the salvors of the hull, that cost $35,000, then another $15,000 went to creditors, so by the end, there was nothing left. Aid for families actually came from the Western Electric Company, the City of Chicago and the Red Cross, but that was it. There was no watershed reform of maritime safety. In fact, there was no regulatory result at all. Eastland and her 844 victims slipped from the headlines and slowly faded from memory, while the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company and its owners and officers escaped scot-free. This infamous disaster didn't result in any major precedent of law, although it damn well should have. The Eastland sinking serves as a tragic reminder of what happens when businesses are allowed, unchecked and unregulated, to maintain unsafe standards of practice. In Chicago today, as people hurry and bustle past the LaSalle Street Bridge on their way to work, they could be completely forgiven for missing the metal plaque installed in 2003 that commemorates the tragedy. It's hard to imagine that there, in the middle of that vibrant town, a disaster had taken over 840 lives. And there, on the other side of the river, still sits the red-bricked Reed, Murdoch & Co. building, a silent sentinel and witness to one of history's most tragic maritime disasters, the day the Eastland rolled.